I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
In November 2017, Warner Bros. Finally gave the world its first live-action depiction of the DC Comics classic superhero team, the Justice League. Building upon the previous films of Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, Suicide Squad, and Wonder Woman, this historic team-up was to be their answer to Marvel's insanely successful Avengers. However, instead of a collective fist bump for fans of comic books and cinematic universes, Justice League was a baffling display of studio meddling, competing tones, storyline dead ends, and some seriously unfinished CGI. So let's take a look back at everything that went wrong and try to piece together this full story of what the f*** happened to this movie. The road to Justice League began with Zack Snyder's Man of Steel and his somewhat divisive take on the mythos of Superman. Having already seen Christopher Reeve's optimistic and hopeful Superman of the 70s and 80s, Zack Snyder and writer David Goyer envisioned the last son of Krypton in today's pessimistic, distrustful society. An idea Snyder doubled down on in the sequel Batman v Superman. What is an all-powerful superhero in a world of 24-hour news, tribalist politics, and a vicious online culture?
Are there any moral constraints on this person? We have international law. On this earth, every act is a political act.
Perhaps it was a bleed-in from the only lesson Hollywood learned from Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Go dark. But it's important to know where Snyder was coming from and what he had planned for Superman. In October 2014, Warner Bros. Announces their massive slate of DC comic book movies, with Batman v Superman as their kickoff for the DC Extended Universe, introducing us to Ben Affleck's Batman and the first ever film versions of The Flash, Wonder Woman, Cyborg, and Aquaman. Among those plans, Justice League, as a two-parter, both to be directed by Zack Snyder and written by Oscar-winning screenwriter of Argo, Chris Terrio. Fast forward to August 2015, where Snyder screens an early cut of Batman v Superman to Warner Bros. Executives, who reportedly gave the film a standing ovation. They had a surefire hit on their hands, and how could you not, with two of the biggest superheroes of all time in one film? Then in March 2016, the film released to a massively divided audience and a far weaker box office than predicted.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Critics were either underwhelmed or downright savage. Fans were split in two, those who applauded Snyder's daring vision of blurred morals and conflicted superheroes, and those who couldn't forgive the glaring plot holes and yearned for the return of the always bright beacon of hope, Superman. With Justice League's production just beginning that following April, the response left executives scrambling. Where did we go wrong? Whose fault is it? How do we fix this? Again, a lesson learned in Hollywood never seems to be the right one, and this time around they concluded what was missing was humor. So mid-production, Snyder is tasked with giving the dialogue some extra jokes to lighten the mood. Barely a month later, Affleck is given an executive producer credit to ensure any changes to Batman don't interfere with his solo film. And comic bigwig turned producer Jeff Johns is brought in to oversee the DCEU, after killing it with the launch of CW's Arrow and Flash. And by June, he declared that Justice League would be hopeful and optimistic. Yet was this what Snyder originally had in mind? To prove their dedication to course correcting, Warner Bros. Invited media outlets to a set visit. Here we learned that Bruce Wayne would serve as the symbol of hope, Barry Allen would provide the comic relief, and that Justice League was now only one film. That year's Comic-Con, we got the first teaser, showing up the lighter tone, all to the rock and roll sounds of the White Stripes. For the rest of 2016, production was relatively quiet, at least to the public, but let's bookmark this and return to it later. After the release of a new trailer in March of 2017, fans were still wary, but hopeful that the musical chairs of producers would lead to a better film. Then May of that year, tragedy struck when it was announced that Zack Snyder was stepping down as director after the death of his daughter 2 months earlier. He thought burying himself in his work would help him through the pain, but it wasn't working, and he ultimately decided to step away from the movie, along with his wife and producing partner, Deborah Snyder. Furthermore, the film was not going to be delayed from its November 17th release date, and that Joss Whedon, of all people, would be taking over. After showing a rough cut of the film to Whedon earlier that year, Snyder asked him to help write additional scenes, and naturally, Warner Brothers selected Whedon to finish the film. And who better than the man who successfully pulled off Marvel's historic superhero crossover, The Avengers. Whedon's job was to guide the project through the rest of post-production, write and direct the reshoots, and complete Snyder's vision. It was a crazy turn of events that quickly turned sour as story after story leaked. Warner Brothers was spending $25 million for the reshoots, nearly 3 times as much as any comparable blockbuster. Most of the stars were readily available, except Henry Cavill, who was in the midst of filming the latest Mission Impossible. The primary difficulty had less to do with Cavill's scheduling conflicts and more to do with his luxurious Tom Selleck mustache. Cavill's contract with Paramount Pictures allowed him to film reshoots in his own time, but would not allow him to shave. Warner Brothers forked over thousands to digitally remove the mustache and his stubble. Yet the final results are decidedly unconvincing and at times creepy. Instantly the butt of all jokes on the internet, it was a sign of the trouble ahead. Producer Charles Roven stated that Whedon was only reshooting about 15 to 20% of the movie, but thanks to Cavill's unnerving plastic mouth, it had the unintended consequence of showing exactly how many scenes of Superman were obviously reshot or replaced. And it was a lot. Whedon's takeover was much more extensive than originally thought. After the monumental success of Wonder Woman reaffirmed Warner Brothers' belief that superhero films didn't need to be bleak, introspective thought pieces, Whedon was being tasked to overhaul the film in an almost completely different direction than what Snyder had planned, to reshape it from the darker version already shot into an optimistic picture with some levity.
Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
All throughout, he was micromanaged to hell. One example confirmed by actor Holt McCallany was the opening Gotham scene that Whedon intended to be funny, but was re-edited by the studio so it wouldn't be, leaving audiences confused. And to make matters worse, the studio mandated that Justice League be under 2 hours, attempting to alleviate audiences' fatigue over bloated superhero flicks. To do it, Whedon rumoredly had to cut nearly an hour out of Snyder's original footage, tossing out entire scenes of Aquaman's backstory with Willem Dafoe, Barry Allen's love interest Iris West, played by Kiersey Clemons, and Robin Wright returning as Antiope in an assumed flashback. He also replaced Batman v Superman co-composer Junkie XL with Danny Elfman. Through all of this, Whedon had to stitch together a narrative that still made sense. By the time the film released on November 17, 2017, with Zack Snyder as the sole credited director and Whedon as simply a co-writer, fans, overloaded by all the behind-the-scenes drama, went out of morbid curiosity. Reviews praised some moments, but the Frankenstein's monster of a movie was too apparent, from the rapidly shifting tonal changes to the complete lack of polish in editing and CG. And mainstream moviegoers were unsure to recommend it. Its $229 million domestic box office finish, while fantastic for a mid-budget romantic comedy, definitely was not for an over $300 million comic book blockbuster that was meant to usher in a new wave of superhero films.
The sound of silence.
Warner Brothers had destroyed all good faith earned with Wonder Woman, and their DCEU was back to hanging by a thread. The internet quickly began compiling the multitude of deleted shots and inconsistencies from the trailers, questioning where it all went and where it could have fit. Besides the unmistakable palette swap from dark blue to aggressive red in the finale, gone are scenes of Bats and Wonder Woman discussing recruitment, Flash running through glass, and almost all pieces shown of Cyborg, including his backstory as a football player. Radio chatter in the trailers hinted at a world in disarray after the death of Superman, something that in the final film only seems to affect the opening credits and Wonder Woman's first sequence. In their place was dodgy green screen conversations with Whedon's trademark and possibly misplaced quips,
Dostoevsky,
paper-thin backstories, an uninspired score too reliant on nostalgic cues, and a horribly rendered CG villain with a vague motivation. After picking the movie and trailers apart, line by line, cut by cut, fans had created a rough idea what they speculate Snyder's original vision was. Some have come to assume that Steppenwolf wasn't as big of a character and completely different looking, and perhaps he wasn't the only bad guy. And they weren't talking about Darkseid either. Interestingly enough, many think that Superman may have been an anti-hero or a full-blown antagonist of the film.
Tell me, do you bleed?
Following the plot threads laid in Batman v Superman, it isn't a crazy theory. Batman's entire arc is about stopping Superman before he turns evil. 2 out of 9 of the dream sequences in BVS confirm this fear. The first being Batman's nightmare about a post-apocalyptic world overrun by parademons and foot soldiers with Superman's crest. This is immediately followed by the vision of Flash delivering a message of how Bruce was right to fear him. Snyder later hinted that these scenes were inspired by the Injustice video game, where Superman becomes an evil tyrant after being deceived into killing Lois Lane. One of the only scenes to have made the final cut with the real shaven Henry Cavill is Soup's resurrection fight, a decidedly evil moment for the character. Combine this with Cavill teasing Superman's infamous black suit, a suit he wears when he was resurrected in the comics, and cinematographer Fabian Wagner confirming some footage was shot with it. It all starts to make sense. Why would they need to replace every Superman scene if not to alter his storyline throughout the film? After all the backlash Warner Brothers received for their brooding take on Superman, it stands to reason that they used Whedon as an opportunity to backtrack to the Superman of old. Unsatisfied by the whole ordeal, fans began petitioning Warner Brothers to release the Snyder Cut, the hypothetical version of Justice League before Whedon was brought on. And as each story came out detailing the troubles behind the scenes, the movement only grew. Former crew members and industry insiders all had different opinions of whether this cut even existed. But after Whedon dropped out of his planned Batgirl film, Snyder started his subtle, passive-aggressive campaign on social media by liking the news that Whedon was leaving the DCEU. This was the first sign that something wasn't right with Snyder and Warner Brothers, and he wasn't happy with how things turned out. From there, he kept posting pictures and random tidbits that alluded to cut characters, moments, and themes that clearly weren't in the final film. All this boiled to fever pitch when one reporter threw out a rumor he had heard from multiple sources that Zack Snyder did not leave voluntarily and that he was fired in early 2017. While the complete story is still a mystery, more reports came in about how troubled the production actually was, long before Whedon took over. Let's go back to the producing shuffle in May of 2017, when Jeff Johns took a lead role. Reportedly, Johns was a major factor in the push towards lightening the tone. He was consistently on set, rewriting scenes and dialogue, filling in for Warner Brothers' knee-jerk reaction to Batman v Superman. At one point, Chris Terrio was so fed up with the situation, he yelled at Johns, "Maybe try using some of my pages."
Oh, see, now that's cold. That's a betrayal.
This battle of conflicting ideas resulted in a messy rough cut that bounced wildly in tone. By late January, Warner Brothers got so sick of the issues, they brought in a group of writers to review the project and offer feedback. The room included Seth Grahame-Smith, Wonder Woman scribe Alan Heinberg, and Joss Whedon. Shortly after, between January and March, they fired Snyder and appointed Whedon. A narrative that, if proven true, flies in the face of everything we were told and raises a lot of questions. Most importantly, did Warner Brothers use the death of Snyder's daughter as an easy out? And why would Snyder go along with it? Again, all rumor. Recently, there have been reports that Snyder, jaded by his treatment and empowered by his fans, has still been working on completing his version in secret. News that made the Snyder Cut campaign lose their collective minds. But Warner Brothers would likely never entertain the idea of releasing it. By doing so would admit defeat, bring further embarrassment to the studio, and confuse regular moviegoers. Time will tell. Looking back at all the issues, one has to ask why Warner Brothers didn't delay the film to give it the proper attention it deserved. Why work so hard to release such a subpar product? The answer to all the questions leading up to this point came down to one thing: money.
I'm rich.
Warner Brothers was about to merge with AT&T, and studio head Toby Emmerich and CEO Kevin Tsuchihara were unsure if they were going to still be at the studio. So instead of delaying the film till after the merger, the executives pushed on so they would preserve their bonuses. Bonuses, as it turned out, that were rewarded for making good decisions. Define irony. Suddenly, all the mistakes and poor decisions became so obvious. With the ever-rising costs of big-budget tentpoles that failed to be billion-dollar properties, experts have been forewarning of a major Hollywood collapse, and the DCEU is proving them right. And this is why we keep coming back to the mustache. This is likely to be the legacy fans, movie buffs, and the internet will remember about Justice League. It will forever be the glaring example of a greedy studio letting a blockbuster spin out of control by sacrificing quality to hit a release date. Instead of honoring one of the oldest staples of pop culture history, we got a mindless cash grab and a terrifying upper lip.